trust doctrine is how the variations provides as people may need to relocate right off the coast. I will say in the world of legal academics that do the public trust doctrine, which there's quite a few of, I am the splitter as opposed to all the lumpers. So I like the differences among the states as opposed to their similarities.
Okay, good morning, and it's great to be here. I hadn't really thought about that question, Rob, till you asked it 2 minutes ago. But I do think it, my answer reflects my history and the different dimensions that I've always been trying to bring together through my career work. And so as an undergraduate here at Columbia, actually, a long time ago, I was a geochemistry major, so had an interest in geophysical change. Natural systems. By the end of my time here, became interested in social change and politics. Ended up going to a PhD program in law and policy, got my law degree, so I became very interested in the law. And then through that process, got connected to the California Coastal Commission, which you mentioned, and they're an agency that works with development along the shoreline, and in particular with development right on the shoreline, sometimes on tideland. So all of these questions, the physical changes happening on the shoreline, the legal questions raised by development on the shoreline, and the politics of what happens along the shoreline come together in this thing called the public trust and what to do about it. And later in my time at the Coastal Commission, as climate change became more front and center, the questions about what are we going to do with tideland specifically in relationship to public access, protecting natural beach ecologies and those sorts of things started to come to the fore. And so that's how I got into question more.
Right, a lot. Can you hear me? A lot of similarities. So I started off as a forest ecologist, a small college in Ohio, really worried about how we're chewing up the landscape by developing it and thinking like a lot of natural scientists. I don't know how many natural scientists are in the room, but thinking, I understand what the problem is. If every of those decision makers understood what I understood as a scientist, wisdom would surely dawn upon them and they would make better decisions. So I got interested in the policy world, went and did my master's work in public policy. And I realized, oh my gosh, it's way more complicated than that. Ended up practicing for a while in California, doing environmental impact assessment and dealing with lawyers all the time. And that got me interested in law and local government, because in our country, a lot of land use decision making has been delegated down to local governments in this really complicated intergovernmental system. And then back up at the University of North Carolina, got my law degree and was working on my PhD. And serendipitously for me, the California Coastal Management Commission process was blowing up at the time because people were really pushing hard on the state to start being more demanding of local governments and what they were doing through their local planning and what the whole system was kind of turmoil. So I ended up studying that for my dissertation and finished my work, and this job opens up at Michigan. I should say I'm from Ohio. If you all are familiar with in Michigan and Ohio, there's a little bit of a rivalry that goes on between those two places. I grew up close to the coast in Michigan on Lake Erie. I'm now at Ann Arbor in Michigan. Michigan has one of the longest coastlines in the continental US. And the Great Lakes, excuse me, are really dynamic systems. You cannot see across the lakes. They're major bodies of water. They function like oceans in many ways, but they're different too. And I'll talk more about that in a bit, I think. But the public trust doctrine then becomes a really intriguing issue about, do they apply to the Great Lakes? All of the Great Lakes states have applied them. How do they work? How do some of those issues play out? So I'm very focused on the public trust doctrine that way, but I'm really interested in the intergovernmental dynamics, especially the state-local relationships and who should have the authority to do what and how does that play itself out in terms of on-ground impacts. And at the end of the day, coastlines are really fascinating places to study. People want to build in exactly the most beautiful, dynamic, dangerous, hazardous places all simultaneously at once because they want to be as close to the water as possible. How do you reconcile that? How do you balance private property rights, legal expectations with the ecological impacts of the decision? So as an academic, it's a really fascinating area to study, frustrating too, because we just keep making bad decisions and having to struggle through. So that's
So quick question for the audience, just a quick show of hands. How many people are familiar with the concept of public trust doctrine and what it means? And how many people, well, that's a pretty well-informed audience. That's probably self-selected, obviously. So just in case somebody,
Yeah, we still.
thank you. That's where I was going. Would one of the panelists like to just give a quick explanation of what is public trust doctrine? And also, if somebody wants to find out what it is in their state, where do you go look this thing up? Because it's a little different than most of the laws we work with sometimes.
Take a stab at it. So fundamentally, the public trust doctrine is about a line between what can be privately owned and what is open to the public. And it's associated with the navigable waters, which in the United States are the waters subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, which depending on what coast you're on can actually take you quite a ways inland, and the waters that are navigable in fact. And so what the public trust doctrine says, most fundamentally, and this is coming out of the Illinois Central Supreme Court decision, which a lot of states adopted as they thought constitutional law. That's a different issue, but we'll get there. Basically, you can't put the submerged lands beneath navigable waters into private ownership, except for very limited contexts to promote public use. So like building a dock would be an example. And the public has rights to the navigable waters. Navigation, commerce, and fishing are the traditional three. Recreation, about half the states have said it also extends to water recreation. And then from there, you get into a lot of state variations on what the public uses are. The normal dividing line between public property and private property is the mean high tide line or the mean high water line, depending on what kind of body you're on. But there's a lot of state variations on that. So northeastern states tends to be the low tide line. Hawaii, it's the mean higher tide line, which gives you more beach to the public. And that's essentially what you're talking about. What lands, submerged lands are protected in public ownership with a duty to keep them open to the public for whatever uses the state has said the public gets to make of those waters.
Only the state can really separate that out, correct? I mean,
Correct.
the state is the only one that can proactively say, we are no longer interested in this piece of land.
Correct.
Thing that anybody would like to add.
I'll augment that just a little bit. It is a state doctrine. There are 50 public trust doctrines. Historically, it's people set back to ancient Roman law to set it up, and so there's a lot of variation. It's usually a mishmash of Roman law, constitutional law, statutory law that puts it together and gives it oomph in each particular state. Historically, it was in coastal settings, and again, all of the Great Lake states have recognized and designated the Great Lakes coastlines. A lot of states have also, we have a public trust interest in our inland lakes, but the doctrine is a bit different as it's applied to inland lakes versus. And then Joe Sachs wrote an article in the 70s arguing that it should be to cover all natural resources. So there's a lot of work and argument going on now about it's not just a coast, it's kind of the environmentalist. Yes, we need a doctrine that we can use to protect natural resources. And so there's a lot of work on conceptually trying to expand it to encompass other natural living systems. That's to my mind, less firm than it's the way it's used and thought about in coastal settings.
I would just add, if you go to slide 5, on the rotating slideshow, that's the ambulatory tide line that is at the core of the coastal expression of the public trust. And so in California, we have a California State Lands Commission that is the state agency. Here's the representation of tide, the mean high tide line, which is the intersection of an elevation of the sea with the shoreline, will change depending on the shoreline. So as sand ebbs back and forth, that line moves. Oh, here's another one, yes. So you can see on the one you just had up, Rob, a survey that California State Lands Commission did, other one. I think it's the next one. Yeah, right here on the right-hand side, lower right. They did a survey of a beach out at Hollister Ranch a couple years back. On the left side was where the mean high tide line was located in December, I think. Yeah. And then on the right-hand side, they had to stop, for, I don't know, vacation, I guess. And you saw how it went 60 feet inland just in the next month based on the change in the topography. So we have an agency that is responsible for the leasing of those lands. And that's goes back to the point about Illinois Central. Under what conditions could you give away an interest into those tide lands?
So one of the reasons why public trust becomes so important in an era of rising sea levels in particular and changing water level, atmospheric dynamics, et cetera, is that we end up with situations where decisions we have made in the past to allow development, to allow actions to protect that development, where private actions and private lands are suddenly on public. Technically, they are trespassing public land. What do you see from a climate adaptation perspective? What are some of the biggest unknowns that we're going to have to deal with in applying public trust doctrine going forward? And also how, let me just stop right there. What are some of the biggest unknowns we have applying public trust doctrine in this newly accelerated structure?
So again, I'm going to keep referring to the Great Lakes. That's where my focus and attention is. The Great Lakes are above the sea, so we're not subject to sea level rise. But long stretches of Great Lakes shoreline are highly erodible sands and gravels. So the shoreline has been receding over time, much the same way that ocean coastal shorelines are some sea level rise. We're struggling with the same issues. So we know because of those erosion rates that shorelines are moving remorselessly landward over time. And on the ocean coasts, we know in general that because of sea level rise, there will be lots of shorelines that will move remorselessly landward. The unknowns, I think, are the devils in the details. Where will it happen? How soon will it happen? Apparently sea level rise is happening, but it's happening more in some places given geophysical attributes of the coasts. So it's all the level of details. And then so not knowing for sure when it's going to happen and how bad it's going to be is problematic from the physical side. And then legally side, the unknowns of how are we going to respond to it? How will people, when push comes to shove, you can get people to say it totally makes sense and move back in a rational way, knowing that sea levels are rising and that you can't stop them. But in a personal way, the speaker this morning talked about this. Or one of the speakers mentioned it. The lived reality is people are there. They've invested a lot in their homes. They're going to fight tooth and nail. There's something about being on a coast where your brain just and you're on the coast and you're there and you don't want to leave and you put a house there and you will do everything to fight to keep it there. And the craziness of that, how are we going to respond to that? I think is a big unknown.
Slide 10 shows you that in the stark contrast where show the shoreline currently and then a projected shoreline based on USGS modeling of a hypothetical 1 meter rise in sea level. Slide, the number wrong? Slide 7. So this is the current shoreline in white and the projected tide or shoreline in yellow based on 1 meter of sea level rise. The details, yeah, when is that going to happen? I don't know, but it's projected, and I'm personally confident that it will happen. So the question is, as you said, Dick, what are we going to do when that's where the line is? Obviously, there's a lot of development, a lot of investment, a lot of homes, people in that location. And there won't be a beach there if we don't do anything in the alternative. So there are all kinds of implications of the movement of that line. And legally, going back to your first question, one of the core interests I've always had is what are the public interests in this system? And so earlier we heard a little bit about the right to stay, but I'm interested in the public trust doctrine partly because it's about the rights of the 40 million Californians who have a trust in that land on this side of the country. So there are, complicated legal rights questions that are going to be raised.
Go ahead.
Is directly related to this, or do you want us to hold questions?
Let's hold until we get through a little bit more, if that's okay. You can jot it down then. Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I would add to that, there are a lot of uncertainties in exactly how it's going to occur. So we tend to think about sea level rise as gradual, incremental. If you think about Florida with the sunny day floods, the high tides are getting higher. Then you have some days where you're not flooded, and then the high tides get higher, and you get octopuses and parking garages and things like that. That's one kind of change, but for a lot of places, the impact of the sea level rise is actually going to kind of come in a storm. So a hurricane or a major storm on the West Coast that suddenly everything that had been kind of building up in the system, you get this mega storm that happens to hit at high tide, and suddenly your coastline is forever altered. Well, those two processes potentially have legally different consequences as well, because the gradual changes, the rule on the ocean and most bodies of water is that the property line moves with the gradual change. So if your beach is being eroded, your property line is moving. If you happen to be one of the lucky places where you're on a rising coast, and we do have those as well, then as you know, as it rises, you're gaining property as the land shifts toward the sea. But if it happens suddenly, like during one of those storms, that could be legally classified as an evulsive event, which means the property lines stay where they were. Which means you've got potentially a private landowner owning something that's underwater. There have been weird cases in Florida involving islands that disappear and reappear on what happens to the private ownership on those situations. But that's something that people have to anticipate with the public trust doctrine as to exactly how will that coastline change, and how do we want to play out the legal consequences of that. Another thing I'll mention is if you were at the plenary, you saw the big lines of everybody still moving to the coast. And there are several coastal states that have what I call evolving public trust doctrines. They basically say our doctrine can evolve to meet the needs of future generations. How much anticipation can be built into the public trust doctrine of maybe we have to do different things for the people who are already there, but can we anticipate for the people who are still moving to the coast that this is going to be a future problem, and use land use planning and housing and other incentive systems to not put even more people in the zone that's going to be problematic. So those are some unknowns, I think, for me.
And I want to riff on that to remind folks that the public trust doctrine is largely a common law judge-made body of law that could change theoretically as these issues come up and as courts start to see things differently. The doctrine of avulsion has never made sense to me. And it was made by judges, what, 100, 200 years ago, based on what they understood at the time about these dynamics. And how much does it make sense? So Joe Sachs wrote about this too. Maybe time for the courts to be rethinking. We've also Doctrine, you probably read it more on this than I have too, but that's a whole nother level of uncertainty. How will the courts rethink things as evidence is put in front of them, pointing out it doesn't work anymore the way that you've thought about this in the past? And will they respond to that? So that our last Michigan Supreme Court decision was a very conservative court, and they actually expanded the public rights. They made it clear we have rights to walk on the beach because of all of the inland folks who live in the Great Lakes who use the beaches. So even the liberal conservative split might not really predict well where a court might go, depending on the evidence that's in front of it. So there's a whole lot of legal uncertainty here too about how this might.
So a lot of the pictures that are showing up here all show things that have been built in the past that are a result of past decisions that we're now struggling to figure out how to correct, deal with, how public trust. Charles, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the things that California is doing, where there does seem to be more interest proactively asserting public trust doctrine, maybe even into kind of a bringing future conditions into decisions today.
Sure. And I think it's your last slides, which are not on our numbered slide. If you go to the slide that shows, yeah, that one. So most of you probably know or are aware that the California Coastal Commission has never been shy. And so it's always had a forward-looking, proactive regulatory approach to protecting public interest in the shoreline. And in the first 50 years or the first 40 years, what that meant was if you proposed to develop along the shoreline, like the stretch in Malibu, the quid pro quo or the condition that was imposed was you need to dedicate access between your development and the mean high tide line to the public. That's what these colored rectangles are, different dedications that were required over the years by the Coastal Commission for like a new house or a redeveloped house, an additional room, whatever it was. They would impose an access dedication. Those become restrictions on your property, your deed. And so it was a forward-looking property notification, both for the homeowner and future owners. Yes, you have a dedication on your land out to the mean high tide that the public can use, and also a granting of that public space to the rest of the world. So there was this proactive history, all of which, by the way, is tied to the mean high tide line. So one of the reasons I'm interested in this problem is because we spent 40 years gaining all this amazing access, and now it's going to gradually diminish as that mean high tide line moves inland. As a cul-de-sac here, there is this one easement I found on the right where the Coastal Commission made the easement ambulatory. So both the seaward and the landward line in the easement are ambulatory in the deed. There's some uncertainty. How's that going to play out when that gets to the back of the lot? So in that, it's with this framework of using the regulatory process to restrict future uses that the Coastal Commission has started to deal with the public trust interests also. And I think it's the other last slide, which just has some distilled language that they've started to put into their deed restrictions. So if you build a new house now on the shoreline and you're anywhere near the immediate shoreline, the Coastal Commission will ask you to record a deed restriction, which does an assumption of risk. So you recognize that you're in a hazardous location. You waive any liability against the state and or the local government, perhaps. You commit to never building a seawall on your property, and now you commit to moving your development if it's no longer located on private land in the future. So if it becomes located on the public tidelands, you may have to remove it. again, a lot of legal uncertainty there as to what will happen when that actually, starts to unfold.
And are there other examples where states are or possibly could do something similar? Robin, I think you've written about the role of notice or disclosure in development decisions, permit conditions, et cetera, as possibly being able to achieve similar ends. So when they do take an action and it has the potential to infringe on the public trust at some indeterminate time in the future, they are theoretically aware of what they were getting into.
Yeah, there are some states that have experimented with deed notices, all the things you have to be given notice of when you buy a property, of putting in there that you're on the coast. It could get inundated, it could become public land. Not surprisingly, in most states, those are resisted by the real estate lobby. But when they've been put in, they can be fairly effective at putting people on notice. And I should note, historically, we're in kind of a weird reversal. If you go back and read colonial cases involving the shoreline, the basic gist of them is you were an idiot for building next to the coast. If you got in trouble, it's on you. So
Those Puritans, they just took a very
all right.
so
So we've developed this sense of safety that was kind of false to begin with. So, but the notification statutes can be helpful where they've been put in. If you're also interested in this, John Nolan out of Pace University has done a lot of work on what he calls climate bubbles, where real estate has been in artificially inflated in price given the risk it's subject to. And he and his students actually track where those bubbles are popping, where the real estate price is starting to reflect a growing public awareness that this is actually not a great place to live. And so, but that's another form of notice, just when it gets into the public mind enough that this is not a good place to own real estate. The housing market does respond, at least in some locations.
I'll riff on that too. I think of it as this $6 million man problem. We have the technology, we can fix it. There's this mindset, and now we can live in these highly dynamic systems, but we have the engineering systems that will make it all work, and it'll be great. And on the Great Lakes, people want to build seawalls when the lakes come up and the home is at risk. And I know anecdotal at least, design engineers will go out and tell folks they're trying to sell a seawall to, we can build a seawall that will protect you, and when the lakes go back down, the sand will come back and you'll have a better beach than you ever had it before. We have the engineering, we can solve all of these problems. When they present them to the local officials and say, we can do this, it'll be great, there's a asymmetry in technical knowledge. Local officials don't have engineers there telling them, actually that's not true. So there's a disconnect from what the technical knowledge that's available and how it's being leveraged, even in a place where you would think people would know this is not a good place to build. Right? We're living on the lakes now. We're not living with them. We've kind of got this bad mindset. We need to shift back to thinking about recognizing these are dynamic systems and engineering take you so far.
I was just gonna riff on that, which is, parts of California probably are these extreme places where it's not clear when people will be willing to stop paying to stay, even if it's for another week on the coast. And so there's a lot of money. The engineers can do incredible things, and they build massive caisson castles on the shoreline, and they're going to be there a while. And so one of the proactive things that I try to talk about when I talk about public trust is because of this coming clash between the public tideland interest and private upland interests that will result in litigation and lots of conflict if we don't do something else. That's why adaptation planning at the community level and some of the broader themes of this. How do we adapt at a community level to deal with the kind of coastline we want. Because I'm pretty certain that hashing this out in the courts isn't going to result in beaches, for example.
So in a lot of our coastlines, this is a problem that's starting to arise or has been arising in recent years. The Great Lakes are really interesting because when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about feet of sea level rise over the next several years and coming decades. When you talk about the Great Lakes, we have seen multiple feet of lake level change on all of the Great Lakes in just the last 10 to 13 years. We've seen record lows and record highs, swings of 15 feet. How is that exposing some of the chinks in the prior historical applications? Exposing what we need to possibly do more proactively going forward.
So this is my invitation to talk a little bit more about the Great Lakes. And I'm realizing I should have included a slide of a hydrograph. So you all know the Great Lakes, not really sure why, but they follow a sine curve. So they're large enough to behave like oceans in a lot of ways, not quite large enough to be tidal. So we don't get a very predictable movement of the high tide line. So you don't talk about the high tide line on the Great Lakes. We do get seiches where the water is basically sloshing back and forth. We now know there's a thing called a meteo tsunami. If you get a storm system set up just the right way and move across the lakes, usually it's from west to east, it'll push water really hard against the shoreline. So there are, we're finding instances where there'll be a harbor structure that almost instantly is underwater dramatically and then down again, and it's really dangerous. If you go swim on Lake Michigan, be careful. There are a lot of rip currents. You got to be mindful of how the currents are moving. But so those are kind of the near-term dynamics. So we do get seasonal fluctuations. We get really big fluctuations over the course of decades. So in sea level rise, we're worried about sea level rising, inches a year. On the Great Lakes, you can see these dramatic swings in standing water levels over the course of a decade or two. So they're constantly going up and down. And if you know anything about ocean coastal beaches, people talk about a winter beach and a summer beach. So in the winter, the conditions are such that the oceans tend to push sand up onto the beach and inflate them. In the summer, they tend to chew away and the beaches deflate. That happens on the Great Lakes, but like an order of magnitude greater. So when we're in a period of high water, the lakes are chewing away really aggressively, particularly in these sandy beaches, where we'll have bluffs, high bluff systems that will just give way. And when a bluff goes, it doesn't just slowly erode, it catastrophically fails. Is that an evulsive event or is that something else? I mean, that's where those issues start to play out. So we'll have the shoreline move really aggressively landward for a period, but then the lakes drop and they stay down and the beaches start to inflate. And people see this great big sandy beach appearing and then they start to think, because they think, oh, look at all that beach, I can build a house. It would be a great place, I can be closer to the water. So one of the images that was cycling through is a big beach house that's sitting really close to the water. That's on Lake Michigan, close to St. Joseph, Michigan. I always ask folks, where do you suppose the folks who built that house came from? And when I always hear Chicago, they were from Chicago. No, there we go. They actually came from the house right behind it. They grew up there, they lived there. The lakes had been down for an unusually long period of time. They decided we want to live closer to the beach. The city couldn't stop them at the time. They didn't have any setbacks in place to tell them you can't do that. All of the neighbors gave the city money to do a study to adopt a setback because the neighbors realized they're going to want to build a seawall. And as soon as they do that, that's going to screw up our beach. And so the city adopted a setback and then the lakes came back up. And the property owners went to the city to get a permit to build a seawall. And the city said, no, we told you not to do that. It was a dumb thing to do. We've adopted a setback. You can't build a seawall. So they had to pick up the house and move it back. Of course, they couldn't really get it back as far as they should have because they had another house right there too. So we do have these periods of high water. We tack our public trust doctrine to the ordinary high water mark. There's a little bit of confusion about where you draw that line. And there's also, if you use an elevation-based standard, it goes back and forth pretty dramatically, almost depending on the day you cite it. It's a really bad measure. I mentioned the beach walking case in Michigan. The court said, no, no, we're going to use a narrative standard. We'll cite it where there's evidence of water having been there in the past. Basically, so that in a lot of places, that means the tree line. So we're in a part of the country where if you don't disturb the land, you'll get trees. So if there are trees there, you know there hasn't been water there. If there's beach, even seagrass beach, you know there's been water there at some point in the past. So you can pretty easily see actually how far the ordinary high water mark has gone. So we'll have some periods where the lakes are really high, there's no beach left. You don't have a beach to walk on, but when the lakes drop, you get lots of big sandy beach. Now you have a public trust right to walk along the beach. So that's the way it's kind of playing out on the Great Lakes. The real challenge we have is the lakes go down, and they go down just long enough for folks to think, oh, there's a beach, I can build a house. And so then people build, and then the lakes come back up, and then they want to do everything they can to protect the house. So we have these periods where we'll have a really aggressive shoreline armoring going on as people try and protect their homes. And different states have dealt with it differently. Ohio is the least protective of the public trust and the most protective of private property rights. And virtually all of Lake Erie has been armored. There's very little natural beach left in Ohio. On the shoreline, this is where the Michigan-Ohio thing comes in. I'm like to my Michigan legislators, please let's not be like Ohio. Michigan has 3,200 miles of shoreline. A lot of that's natural sandy beach. There's a real risk that over time we're going to armor it all in this really slow, incremental, stepwise fashion as we keep letting people build homes that are way too big and permanent, way too close to the shoreline, and then feeling bad for them. I'm sounding kind of harsh, but I mean, I'm not unempathetic with folks who have, particularly you'll hear folks say, my grandfather built this house and I want to give it to my grandkids, and that, you know, they're attached to the place. I get that, but there's a whole lot of McMansions getting built right next to the water that really shouldn't be there. Frankly, there's a social equity thing going on too. They're being built by very wealthy folks. Are we going to subsidize are we going to indemnify them with the loss of public resources because they made a poor choice on where to site their home? Really difficult issues, and they're playing themselves on the Great Lakes in a way, maybe in a little bit more slow motion fashion, but just as really compelling, I think, in terms of what are we going to do.
So one more question, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. So be thinking of what you would like to ask the panel right now. Just revolving around all of this is this concept of stationary, and that permeates all of our public. This concept that the past is a predictor of the future, and we can make decisions that have to live with consequences for 50, 60, 70 years or more, without considering what the world is going to look like 60, 70 years. Base it on. All of that is turned on its head in an era of climate change. If you were advising states on how they should be applying public trust doctrine to enable better decision making that will be durable for decades to come, you know, what would that advice be?
I'll give it a try. So I worked on a guidance document for the state of California, and then the Coastal Commission adopted some public trust guidelines, partly based on that work. And, you know, a lot of it's about simply explaining, first of all, educating about what public tidelands are. And, you know, as Robin pointed out, that's really going to depend. I think your comments, Dick, also just underline the geography, the geology, the geomorphology of a place is going to determine how those challenges unfold too. So in California, a lot of homes with seawalls are on cliffs, and so they're not really on the tide line per se, but they are building seawalls to protect their eroding cliffs, and that's ultimately the problem when the mean high tide, you know, gets up to those signals and there is no beach. So the guidance is, you know, to understand how tidelands work, what your interests are. That's a public space. It's a shared commons. And how to build that into future decision making is largely what I think is the need, which is how do we provide the notice and inform people ahead of time if they're getting in a situation that may not last. And it's just the frustration of challenge I see in, at least in California, because there's plenty of money involved. We'll litigate. And so we are going to be litigating this question. So I like to talk about the Milner case, which I don't think we have a slide for, but a Ninth Circuit case rooted in the common law. So sometimes the common law unfolds in some interesting ways. This goes back to your initial remark, Rob, about future trespass. In the Milner case, the Army Corps of Engineers brought a case against homeowners trespass onto tidelands. Because they built a revetment, and they said you were on the tidelands, and you also were joined by the Lumi tribe, which the court found in favor of the Army Corps on the basis of this common law notion that when you have an ambulatory boundary, the rights of that ambulation accrue to both sides. So if it moves seaward, then that land inland owner accrues that land, and the opposite. So court concluded that private homeowners couldn't stop the movement of that line without the agreement of the other side. If you think about it, will be a really interesting large political conflict. And so I think we need to start understanding that dynamic, and what I worry about is that we'll see some changes in the legislature, from the legislature, politically redefine what those rights are.
And I'll riff off of that because that case is great. It sounds and takings basically, but it's one of the few takings cases on the coast where there actually was another entity on the other side, the Lummi tribe. And it changed the dynamic because most of the time you're gonna get a lot of takings cases on the coast as people are fighting to put up seawalls, and they all get litigated as if there is no owner on the other side. There is an owner on the other side. It's the public. It's the state. That case, there was a clear, identifiable, in the courtroom, in your face other owner, and it changed how the case was actually decided. So, in terms of advice I would give to states is remember there is another owner you're protecting on the other side, and don't be quite as afraid of the takings cases as most states are. Now, I will give the California Coastal Commission most gutsy in your face state agency award any day of the year because they're not, but a lot of states are. But the other piece of advice, well, two pieces I would emphasize. It's already been mentioned. You got to think in terms of what the community wants, because a lot of these adaptation plans, adaptation agreements have to be community-based, community-type agreements. And there are some really good tools out there now for having those community discussions well in advance of a crisis. Crisis moments not being the best moments for rational decision making and long-term planning. New Zealand put out a what they call a serious game for doing this planning. There are others out there, and just to have that discussion ahead of time of what's important. And maybe you don't start with the physical moves. Maybe you start with things like, let's get the toxics out of our community if we're going to be getting worse storms. You know, if you think about Houston and Hurricane Harvey, that was a toxic soup because of all the manufacturing that's there. Now, I'm not saying a lot of that's going to be leaving Houston anytime soon, but for smaller communities with more identifiable and more addressable sources of toxins, maybe think about building codes. Maybe you think about where's the new housing going? Maybe it should be inland instead of on the coast. There are easier decisions to make that can help make the transition easier, but that has to start with a community discussion. And then the last thing I was mention is I don't like to think of about the public trust doctrine in isolation. It's a cool doctrine. There are some really cool things states have done with it, but it comes in the context of a lot of other authorities that states have, both on the coast, and in terms of land management and states and local communities, I should mention. And that, that goes all the way back to traditional common law condemnation authority. Once a building has become a public safety hazard, it can be ordered removed. I mean, that is an authority that almost all states or local communities, it gets lodged in different places in different states, have retained. You have the building code authority, you have the land use management authority. There's a lot of other authorities that can be combined with the public trust doctrine in anticipation of a changing coast. And if you happen to be one of the communities that's on a rising coastline, you might want to start thinking about your neighbors coming to you as their coastlines uh, erode or decrease or get inundated. So, like I said, I'm a big fan of community planning, but with all of those tools brought to bear at the same time.
Okay, so I'll riff off of that a little bit. The message that I usually convey to folks when I go out and talk to communities and state officials, a couple of key points. One is, if you're on a highly dynamic coastal shoreline, particularly one that's slowly receding landward over time, then you need to recognize this is time to just have different conversations and recognize there are trade-offs that are going to be involved, and there are no silver bullet solutions where you can have it all. We just don't have the technological solutions that will solve all of our problems. And that means you're going to have to decide, local community, are you going to save the beach house or are you going to save the beach? Because you can't do both. If you decide you're going to save the beach house, that means you're going to be installing seawalls and you're going to lose the natural beach eventually. If you decide you're going to save the beach, then you need to tell property owners, we're not going to let you build a seawall. And the time will come where you're going to have to pick up your house and move it back. It's going to naturally um, bottomlands. And so it's time to have those difficult conversations and recognize we're facing some trade-offs that we're just going to have to decide. The follow-ons to that, I'm a little bit worried about a couple things. There's a lot of attention right now onto nature-based solutions, nature-based shorelines, because it sounds like, oh, we could do that and have our beach and save the beach out too. The problem is, as I hear from all of my engineering colleagues, at some point, they just don't work. You're in a high enough energy system, you basically still have a seawall, you just put a tree on top of it. You've lost their natural system. So we need to really avoid promoting the idea that there are nature-based solutions out there that will solve our problems. That's leading us in the wrong direction. The other pernicious, I think of them as pernicious, persistent regulatory policies. In Michigan, the state says, we're not going to let you build a seawall unless there's no longer a reasonable, prudent alternative to doing so, which means they've essentially said, we're going to let you build a seawall eventually. They've just kind of pushed off down the road. It happens. So we've decided we're going to armor all of our Great Lakes beaches. We should recognize the decision that was made there. The other problem, and I'm seeing this more with local governments, is they think if we do a setback from the shoreline, we're good. We never have to address it again. We've kept folks away from that dangerous spot. But if the setback is based on a naturally receding ordinary high water mark, then the setback has to recede as well. So if you're going to do setbacks, you have to create a setback system, and whether it's an easement or a title dedication or something, or a doctrine that just says, as the shoreline moves, it's going to naturally convert. You want to set up a setback with a lot of public education and notice, so folks realize the time is going to come where I'm now within this zone of coastal influence, and it's just a matter of time before I'm going to lose my house. So none of this is going to be easy, and it's going to be lots of really hard conversations and really hard decisions, and a pretty strong shift of mindset about what it means to own coastal property. And you need to own it, you need to buy it and enjoy it while you have it, but recognize you're not going to have it forever, and that's hard.
You can point them to California for both of those points. On seawalls, because of the way the law was written, if you had an existing structure at the time the law went into place, you basically have an entitlement to seawall with all of that Well, let's try to avoid it if we can. Feasibility. Oh, can't move the house. Um, we haven't been able to really stop seawall development. Where there was an urban development pattern already in Southern California. Or, ask them if they want to be like Southern California. With new houses, really for the last 30 years, that deed restriction I referred to is effectively a rolling easement. If you say to somebody, yeah, you can build your house, set it back to be safe for as long as you think it will be, but by the way, we're not going to let you build a seawall. It will, internalize the decision sometime in the future when that house becomes a danger.
And then you have to be willing and able to enforce it.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We're going to start with the person who had a question early on, Stephanie.
During the dynamism of the session. But, multiple centuries, the hope is that the earth will cool down and the will drop. And it seems like you're saying that will then shift into private. And I guess I'm just wondering, and I'm thinking about this too, is there something we should be doing legally now? I mean, this is an opportunity to reshape public access to the coastline. But presumably if it all shifts back to private, I don't exactly understand how that transition occurred. And then would lose potential public access. So I guess I'm wondering, should there be some sort of permanent dedication of the now submerged land or access routes? Sorry.
I would be really hesitant to predict anything 2 centuries out on the coast. So I mean, literally, I wouldn't even know where you would want to put them. But interestingly, access is not necessarily a public trust doctrine, right? There are states that have made it one, Hawaii being a prominent one, New Jersey being a prominent one. But that's one of the state variations on whether to do it. So if you were even going to try, and like I said, in such a dynamic system, I don't even know that you could guess where you would want them to be centuries out. But
It's just access. Is there a way of legally retaining more public control on submerged water once it recedes?
well, once it recedes, it's public water, and if you're on the coast of the Great Lakes, it's automatically going to be navigable. But to change that dynamic border, you would have to then change the law to say once it becomes public, it's always public. There hasn't been great enthusiasm for doing that in the places where it's been asked. Florida being one of the places where you've had that kind of dynamism already, and the Florida Supreme Court basically said, if it was private, became public, is re-exposed, it goes back to being private. So you'd have to change that basic rule of waterfront property.
Most judges haven't studied coastal geomorphology. And the logic to them, the reason that they're willing to allow the public to take a public trust interest when land recedes is because they like the idea that the private property owner will get it if the land accretes. So if you undermine that logic by saying, well, we'll take it when it's public, but we're not going to let it go back to private, you've undercut a lot of the logic that the courts buy into with an ambulatory. So I think you would get into a lot of trouble if you try and go through the common law to say, well, we're going to take it, but we're not going to let it go back. I don't think on the Great Lakes, even if the sea levels start to go back down, we're still going to have receding shoreline. So I don't think we're going to see that happen. And I don't see any evidence. I mean, maybe sea levels will start to go back down in 2 centuries, but I'm not thinking that's going to be a near term.
One more question right
for us to
here.
deal with.
Yeah, I had a question about all these state differences and how this law is interpreted. And when you think, for instance, between Ohio and Florida and California, are there any factors that stand out to you as like, oh, these factors mean they're great setback rule? Or like, do politics play into it, or is there any way of kind of predicting how states manage their coastal land?
I can tell you with recreation, it really helped when states started developing recreational industries. And this is mostly on rivers. So I told you I worked for the state of Oregon. Oregon got really interested in declaring a lot of rivers public, navigable and public, like the Rogue River was a famous case in Oregon when the kayaking and canoeing industry got to be a big money maker in the state. Um, California has and Hawaii have particularly robust public trust doctrines because beaches have always been important. Hawaii gets an extra shot in the arm because of the Native Hawaiian public trust that overlies it. So like I said, it always helps to have economics driving somebody to be arguing for a more expanded. Some of the more interesting ones have been the states that have said that the bottom lands actually are in private ownership. I told you, the Northeast tends to be the low tide line, so that means a lot of the beach is actually in private ownership. But still say the public's going to have a right to use the water. And so that's another way to go. That states have done it. So, like I said, I look for the economics driving legal and political decisions.
I would add to that. I think a lot of it is social, just custom. So, and frankly, I'm not to be too cynical, but the facts of the case and what really angered the justices. So the beach walking case where the Michigan Supreme Court said, yeah, there's a public right to access the beach. The two property owners in litigation, one was a shoreline owner who was mad that the neighbor was walking out in front of their house at the same time that they had the right to walk in front of everybody else's house. And so you could just see the personality about what are you trying to lay claim to against your neighbor, and we're not going to go there. And so in Lucas, commenting just before, the Lucas case, the South Carolina case, the court, the state admitted, yeah, there's no value left in this property. Nobody will ever do that again. The court's been clear that's a regulatory taking. So I don't know how systematically you can look at a state and predict what the doctrine is going to be, because so much of it are site specific and litigation specific. This is all judgment law. Litigation specific facts that drive the court's reasoning and motivates them.
One reason I worry about the legislature jumping in, because like in a place like California or Hawaii, where I think the cultural, the value of the space is really strong, and I have, high confidence in the California public to come out and express themselves when these things start to become evident, the loss of the public space. But what's going to happen then with the political system? Unless, in 200, 300 years from now, I have hope we don't have private property. So that's my concern.
What, another question here?
Lots of questions, great now. Coastal property is kind of, the Milner case is a great example. What's the potential of that? How do we deal with these structures that are impeding or ordinary high water mark when it's up against a private structure? How do we tackle that problem? That's really the issue.
I think it was almost every place is discovered, including California. It's easier to keep them out in the first place than to get them removed once they've been put in. So, if you're dealing with what I'm going to call a grandfathering problem, they're already there and you're trying to take them out, it's going to take money. And I would say probably money plus hazard to human life or structure, which actually isn't all that hard to prove in a lot of places, to get them back out. My sense of it in some places go in fits and starts, so it's kind of hard to say where their trajectory is. Like North Carolina is my infamous example of this. But most coastal states are trending, I would say, toward not allowing new seawalls. Now that gets really hard to say when there's one property left that doesn't have a seawall, because then you get into due process type arguments. But in places where they have large stretches of undeveloped coast left, the trend, and like I said, it vacillates in some places with the politics, is to not allow them in the first place. So I see some hope there, but also with the reality that when push comes to shove, that's going to be politically harder and harder to hold the line on.
Well, I'll just add a few thoughts. So there is one township in Michigan that has banned the installation of hard shoreline armoring. And it was kind of an economic argument. It's a beach community that is mostly still unarmored. And they're thinking, we're a beach community. People come here in the summer to visit the beach. Who's going to want to come to a beach community where there's no beach? And in Michigan, you do have a public trust interest on the shore. So the property owner owns to the water's edge. But this beach walking right gives you the right to walk along the beach if you could get to it. So people love to come to this beach community and then they can walk for miles if it hasn't been armored. So there may be some pressure that communities start to realize, oh, we do need to protect the natural beach because that actually is our economic engine. You can walk up and down the Michigan shoreline and see evidence of past structures that have failed that are in the lakes. And so that opens the door to basically use zoning to declare structures to be non-conforming uses and declare that if they get damaged to a certain point by a natural storm, now you have to take them out. So there may be kind of I would call it an unmanaged to moving away from the shoreline. The big risk is, what if they start building these gargantuan seawalls that will be there for a really long time because there's so monstrous. So maybe we need to, if we're going to let you build a seawall, it has to be a small one, and once it fails, you have to take it out. Or North Carolina is notorious for allowing geotextile tubes as temporary structures that have become permanent structures. You have to have the political will to tell someone it's time to take that out. It's not a hopeful. It's not hopeful looking forward, and it's going to be a long time problem that we're going to be dealing with.
So go to slide 16, and this is Solana Beach, California, where there's a lot of seawalls that have been going in since the 80s. Those are seawalls in the yellow ellipse, right? Naturally required to look like a natural cliff. But I've always thought of this as an amazing geology here. And then you see it turn into kind of this Disneyland landscape. But those are all seawalls approved for existing structures at the top of the cliff. On the right-hand side, those green dots, those are all leases from the State Lands Commission for encroachment onto tidelands. Go to the next, or the previous slide, 15, I think. I'm interested in the language out of Illinois Central, where the state can't give away the trust except to parcels that are used in promoting the interests of the public or can be disposed of without any substantial impairment of the public interest. There's an example slide on right here. This is what State Lands Commission exhibit looks like for those leases, right? And they're saying, oh, it's just a really small encroachment. It's not a significant impact to the public trust. So we're going to give you a lease for that encroachment. But we know, and I think, notwithstanding my comment earlier about the education, I think we know what's going to happen in Solana Beach if you don't do anything and you just keep building walls. The impact is going to be substantial at some point. So one legal question I have is, at what point is it a substantial impairment of the public trust to do this cumulatively? And so Dave, find your attorney who wants to bring that lawsuit. That's what you do. But that's also why every local government in California now looking at adaptation is saying, I know what we're going to do. We're going to add sand to the beach. That's the strategy. We're going to put sand on the beach in front of our walls and hope we don't have to.
Which I've heard an engineer describe as akin to throwing $100 bills out on the beach.
Into a toilet, yeah. Black hole, yeah.
Show of hands for questions again, just to get back here.
Thank you for providing these images. I both makes me want to be rich and like watch climate change happen around one of these big houses, but I also feel like I don't have empathy for those people, which I think is very interesting because they might have had their life savings in it too, who knows? But I'm curious if this is played out anywhere where there are lower income populations than what we've been seeing.
Historically, in flooding areas, you typically saw the lowest income folks living in there because those were the lands that everybody knew was not safe to build. So the old Ninth Ward in New Orleans when Katrina. And anecdotally, I've heard on the Great Lakes, I don't know about the ocean coast, that, you know, early on, a lot of the structures that got built were built by blue collar workers out of Detroit who wanted to go fishing, and they would build fishing shacks. And they knew at some point the lake was going to take that shack. Don't put a whole lot of money in it, be there, enjoy it while you can. But at some point, this mind shift happened. Wealthy folks looking for places to live in really beautiful amenity settings started building more permanent structures, or they took the shack that was there and turned it into a much bigger investment. And so now it's kind of inverted on most of our Great Lakes shorelines. It's the wealthiest of the wealthy who live right on the shore. And now you get into really difficult equity questions about, I said this earlier, when are we going to pay for this, for the beach nourishment, which is expensive in short term? Some communities are doing it themselves. That's okay. Or if we're going to let them armor, we've basically given them public trust. We're giving them submerged bottomland and beach over which people had a public trust right to walk. That's a public giving. Are we going to do that? So there are real equity questions of who can afford to live in these places and what they expect and demand. And we are worried about this Michigan legislature being responsive to them when they go to the legislature. The state public officials are scared to death that the legislature will turn its attention to the beach because it may not be the way that you or I would hope that it would go. Yikes.
I would just add to that, I think the two states where you see the most being done with lower income and or indigenous and or minority communities are Louisiana and Alaska. And Alaska's got several overlays to that issue, but Louisiana, for a variety of reasons, is already dealing with the relocation of entire communities, and they tend to not be wealthy communities.
Right over here.
This is a great timing because I actually wanted to talk about the work that I've seen in the Chesapeake Bay, which is a lot of working plans that are right up next to the shoreline in Maryland and things like that. And the issues that kind of arise from trying to incentivize marsh migration for the needs for carbon sink and just important habitat and natural resources. And at the same time, those are private landowners where there is generally like some lower income folks and also working lands and things like that. And the issues that have been, you're talking about easements as tools to incentivize, protection of natural resources. One of the things that I feel like I've encountered is that you have this dynamic where people are losing their property to meet high water, and and they're also losing their ability to continue to farm in these areas. So I guess I was just curious if you all knew of any examples where, I talk about rolling easements and things like that, where tools like that have been used to help to preserve these important, not only economic practices, but also cultural practices.
I know there has been some conversion of traditional farming, which if you've got saltwater encroaching, you're just not going to be able to do for a variety of reasons. With aquaculture, and the Chesapeake Bay in particular is really interested in getting oyster aquaculture going on a big scale because of what it does for water quality and getting the nutrients out. So that's one type of solution that not just states in the United States, but also countries around the world that have had dry, traditional farming right up to the shore, as that land becomes not only inundated but salinized, so you can't grow normal crops, have tried to switch it over to uh, climate helpful or climate neutral aquaculture facilities is the one example I'm aware of.
I guess I would just say in California, we have, a lot of history of using agricultural easements and in all kinds of situations to protect prime ag or coastal ag land, especially in the coastal zone. And so that's pretty common. We also have some efforts like TNC and local land trusts have been securing easements to allow the shoreline to proceed into the ag land, and then, working with the farmer or the landowner to have that easement in place. But I don't think we've had a case where someone might propose a seawall, for example, to protect the tilled land. And we would probably try to resist that, saying it's not a structure. Although the Coastal Commission did approve seawalls for public golf course. That was the question, is it a structure?
All right, we are almost at time. I'm gonna have one more question. Give me a show of hands again. I didn't memorize where they were from here yet. We have an online question, right? Let's get an online question and then we'll adjourn.
So this is a question from someone joining. We are a low tide ownership state in Maine. Are there any examples where the public trust doctrine has been used successfully to challenge low tide ownership private coastline?
Seaweed harvest has a play in that, yeah.
Yeah, and in Maine has stuck to the low tide ownership against challenge. So I think that one's pretty safe in Maine. The closest, like I said, is a couple of the low tide line states has said, nevertheless, the public has the right to use the water when the water is covering that privately owned land. But no, Maine's pretty clear that's a property question, and we're not changing property law.
Use my prerogative to ask one last question. In 60 seconds or less, what can public interest or public advocacy groups be doing to hold their states accountable for these types of decisions and trying to set the stage for better precedents or right direction?
Just make it clear there's a constituency for that side of the equation. Because in most states, private property owners are going to rise to the occasion. So there needs to be someone on the other side.
I was gonna say exactly that,
Then we're going to move on.
but when you do that, but the planner in me is, but don't someone, it's hard to have empathy for someone who's built a home right on the water's edge. Couldn't you know better? But you have to be a planner and recognize, be a little empathetic and listen to folks. But at the end of the day, make sure that everybody who's going to be affected, including the stakeholders who aren't the shorefront property owners, but have public trust access, are part of the conversation too, because they'll be the thing that prevents the state legislature from completely gutting the law, because they'll be responding to that larger constituency base. So that's political as well. Be mindful of that.
Yeah, I would just agree. Get engaged, but, bridge that gap between the micro and the macro community level, because you need to understand where the public trust interests are and then make that known to the decision makers. That's get engaged, show up and say, you know what, there is a public trust interest. Maybe we should be stepping back more broadly at a community level.
And be creative about who your community is, because in a lot of places, the local fishermen are going to be on the public trust side. So,
Well, thanks a lot for attending. Really appreciate it. Good for our panelists, Dr. Adam Trey, Dr. Dick Norton, and Dr. Charles Lester. They'll be around for the remainder of the conference, or some portion of it at least. Feel free to talk to them. I think some of them are also speaking on other panels. Thanks again for coming.